With the approach of autumn, a layer of long golden fur grows over their bodies. Golden in the purest sense of the word, with not the least intrusion of another hue. Theirs is a gold that comes into this world as gold and exists in this world as gold. Poised between all heaven and earth, they stand steeped in gold. When I first came to the town, it was in the spring. The beasts had short fur of varying colors, black and sandy gray, white and ruddy brown. Some were a piebald of shadow and bright. These beasts of every imaginable shade drifted quietly over the newly greening countryside, as if wafted about on a breeze. Almost meditative in their stillness, their breathing hushed as morning mist, they nibbled at the young grass with not a sound. Then, tiring of that, they folded their legs under them to take a short rest. Spring passed, summer ended, and just now, as the light takes on a diaphanous glow, and the first gusts of autumn ripple the waters of the streams, changes become visible in the beasts. Golden hairs emerge, in scant patches at first, chance germinations of some unseasonable herb. Gradually, whole fields of feelers knit out through the shorter fur until at length the whole coat is gleaming gold. It takes not more than a week from start to finish for this ritual to transpire. They commence their metamorphosis almost at the same time. Almost at once they are done. Within a week, every animal has become completely transformed into a beast of gold. When the morning sun rises and casts newly golden over the world, autumn has descended upon the earth. Only that long, single horn protruding from the middle of their forehead stays white from the base to the slender tip. It reminds one less of a horn than a broken bone that has pierced the skin and lodged in place. But for the white of their horns and the blue of their eyes, the beasts are gold. They shake their heads as if trying on a new suit, thrusting horns high into the autumn sky. They wade into the streams, they stretch their necks to nibble on the autumnal bounty of red berries. As dusk falls over the town, I climb the watchtower on the western wall to see the gatekeeper blow the horn for the herding of the beasts. One long note, then 3 short notes. Such is the prescribed call. Whenever I hear the horn, I close my eyes and let the gentle tones spread through me. They are like none other. Navigating the darkling streets like a pale transparent fish, down cobbled arcades, past the enclosures of houses and stone walls lining the walkways along the river, the call goes out. Everything is immersed in the call. It cuts through invisible airborne sediments of time, quietly penetrating the furthest reaches of the town. That's how Haruki Murakami introduces us to the town in his 1985 novel Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World. That was Alfred Birnbaum and Elmer Luke's translation of the first couple pages of Chapter 2. The even chapters tell the story of this Boku narrator who's arrived in this nameless town to be the Dream Reader. And now, 38 years after writing that novel, and 43 years after writing the novella, which half of that novel is based on, Murakami is about to take us back to that world, apparently. Welcome to the How to Japanese podcast. This is episode 8. These will be the episode where I'm going over a few of the predictions that I would have made had I not known the title to this novel, or had it been an entirely different title. And I'll be going over some of the language that Murakami likes to use. And finally, I'll be making some really heavily spoiler-influenced predictions about the Hardboiled Wonderland content, or the potential for connections with Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World. So you're basically safe to listen to this podcast up until the very end if you don't want Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World spoilers. And I'll make sure to do a big warning before I give anything too specific. But I wanted to start off with a little excerpt from the novel itself to give a sense of the feeling that that novel gives off, and the reason why I think it had such an effect on me when I read it at 17 years old, and how it basically got me into studying Japanese. But I think that the Birnbaum Luke translation is just incredible, incredibly poetic. I think very generous translation, and especially in the End of the World chapters, and actually, to be honest, the Hardboiled Wonderland chapters too. the tone that they're able to create and how different those two tones are is remarkable. So if you haven't read it yet, definitely get on that. You'll have probably, a year or so before the translation for this new novel comes out. So plenty of time to catch up and get a sense of where Murakami might be going. And we know he's going there because today this is April 10th, at least for this part of the podcast. I'll probably record part of this on Tuesday, April 11th. Shinchosha did another announcement, and they released a comment from Murakami in which he says that he started writing this novel in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. He's been working on it for 3 years, and that during that time he basically stayed indoors, didn't go out. Almost like a dream reader in the library, reading old dreams. So very directly making a callback to Hardboiled Wonderland and also this novella that it was based on. So again, originally I was planning on doing a predictions podcast. I was originally kind of planning to do this whole season as I've kind of done it. But the predictions podcast was going to be a more of a core of it, but it's been rendered somewhat meaningless because the title has just given us so much information about what this book is going to be about. If you haven't listened to the first episode yet, please do that. It has almost all the details I know about the 1980 novella and its connection with Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and why Murakami might have decided to use this title. Also, the newsletter that I wrote the day after that, so that would be the March Substack that I put out. Definitely take a look at that. And then the other one thing that I would recommend listening to is I did a translation chat with Jen O'Donnell. Our translation chat is Jen O'Donnell's podcast, and we talked very specifically about translation choices that were made in the process of putting the novel into English. So that would also be, I think, a great point of reference as you're going into this new novel. Before I get into predictions about the book, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the language that Murakami uses. This is kind of prediction adjacent, given that maybe this is language to look out for in Murakami. Part of this is based on an article I wrote for the Japan Times about Killing Commendatore and the language he used there, which was similar to some of the language in his other novels. But on doing my read-through over the last couple months of his novels, one thing I noticed early on was in Pinball 1973, he used the word unzari. This is a word that means frustrated, fed up with, tedious, bored, and I think it captures a bit of his characters' feelings about that particular time in their lives and maybe that particular time in Japanese history where this rapid economic growth is starting to kind of encroach on, for example, the seaside at Kobe, and buildings are starting to go up. You don't see the beach anymore from certain points because buildings are in the way, and also the coastline is slowly being eaten up by real estate. And it's this feeling of not being able to get anywhere. I don't know if we'll see that particular word in this book, but it's one to look out for. The other word from that period of his writing was o. It's a verb that means to cover, and there's a lot of imagery of especially clouds kind of covering things and atmospheres covering things. And then from there, he shifts into Wild Sheep Chase, and he uses the word yare yare a lot, which is a famous Murakami phrase that kind of means like, what the hell, or what the heck, or, oh, that figure is, oh, brother. You see Midori use it a lot in Norwegian Wood as well. I don't know if we'll see that here unless we get the other half of the novel, the Watashi data agent from Hardboiled Wonderland sections of the novel. I could see him using it, but the Dream Reader is kind of ethereally cool and collected in his sections, so I don't know if we'll see that here. Another phrase that Murakami uses often is the verb sonawaru in the form specifically sonawateru. This is a verb that means to be possessed of, to be endowed with, kind of to have a specific ability. That's how it's used with regards to people and certain skills. It can also literally mean be furnished with, be equipped with, but with regards to people having certain skills, it means, endowed with, gifted with. And I first noticed this in 1Q84. He uses it to describe Aomame's ability as an assassin to pinpoint the precise location that she needs to stick with a needle to kill someone instantly, so that it doesn't show up on an autopsy report. It also appears in Killing Commendatore. The artist in that book has this ability to remember faces. Murakami's used it to talk about his own writing abilities, whether or not he's had the skills to write something. And I'm sure that it's been used in other books. So many of his characters have unique abilities. And this is one of the phrases that he uses to talk about it. This one I could see popping up here, especially given that the Dream Reader has such unique skills and has such an important role in the town when he's doing this work of reading the old dreams. He's the only one who can do that, so I could see that happening. And then the data agent as well is equipped with certain skills. In that section of Hardboiled Wonderland, he's one of the few who are chosen to do the shuffling procedure. And if we get that part of the novel, that could very well pop up there. Another set of words that Murakami uses frequently all have to do with the way the characters in his books are drawn to things, pulled by things and people, other characters in the book. And this word is hikareru. It's a passive form of the verb hiku, to attract. And so in this case, the characters are attracted by something or someone. And the phrase you see often is kokoro o hikareta. So I noted this in 1Q84, but also in Killing Commendatore several different times. He talks about being attracted by the painting that he discovers in the attic, and also by the incredible sum of money that Minsky offers to have his portrait painted. It reminds me a little bit of the really famous passage from Pinball 1973, which is Aruhi nanika ga boku tachi no kokoro o toraeru. On some days, something will grab our attention. And he's talking about things that kind of come into your mind and you obsess over for a little bit. And in that book, it's, grieving over a lost girlfriend. And so things like that, I think, hikareru is one of the forces in Murakami's fiction that kind of forces his characters to do things and kind of puts them in these bizarre situations, I think. And then part of that is related to hikidashi, another word that he uses, drawer. Hiku, hikidashi, there's a relation there, I think. And he's used this literally to talk about the study where he keeps pieces of writing, but also metaphorically as somewhere where he keeps memories and thoughts. That might be something that pops up. And also kind of tangentially related to that is nagare, the flow, which came up in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. I think either the Kano sisters or maybe even also, I think, Honda, the kind of bizarre marriage counselor that he starts seeing, Toru starts seeing with Kumiko, who says you have to look for the nagare. You have to look for the flow and just kind of wait for it. But it pops up in Killing Commendatore as well. The narrator says, 目の前にそういう流れがあるのなら、一旦流されてみればいい. If there was a current before me, then let it take me for a while. So the characters often just kind of go with things in Murakami's fiction. And then finally, one of the words that I think ties together most of Murakami's fictions is the verb yugamu, which means to warp or to contort. You also see the noun form yugami, which is distortions, contortions. And you also see a word using the same kanji, an adjective ibitsuna, which means misshapen, distorted, warped. And you see this really early on in Murakami's fiction. This is the word that Naoko uses to describe the kind of psychological distortions she's suffering, the conditions she's suffering. And for example, she writes a letter to Toru from the kind of mental health facility where she's staying outside Kyoto, and she says, 私たちは確かに自分の歪みにうまく順応しきれないのでいるかもしれません。だからその歪みが 引き起こす現実的な痛みや苦しみをうまく自分の中に位置づけることができなくて、そしてそういうものから遠ざかるためにここに入っているわけです。In English, that is, it could be that we're unable to fully adapt to the distortions inside us, so we can't locate the realistic pain and suffering within us that these distortions cause, and we came here to distance ourselves from it all. And she talks about how everyone who's living in this facility kind of understands that they're a little bit different, that there's something not quite completely normal about themselves, and there's an awareness of it, whereas there is not that awareness outside of this facility. She says, 外の世界では多くの人は自分の歪みを意識せずに暮らしています。In the outside world, most people live their lives completely unaware of their distortions. This word is also used in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. He uses it to describe Wataya Noboru. Toru uses a word early in the book talking about the Kumiko's family. He says, 久美子がその家庭の中で屈折した複雑な少女時代を送ったとすれば、渡谷昇は別の意味で不自然に歪んだ少年時代を送った。If Kumiko experienced a twisted, complicated childhood within that family, then Wataya Noboru, in a different sense, had an unnaturally warped childhood. So again, he's using it to describe, in a kind of more negative sense, the kind of problems with Kumiko's brother. And then also in Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Kasahara Mei uses it to describe what happens to her memory of her boyfriend after the accident. She says, 事故のショックで私の記憶みたいなのがぐにゅっと変な風に歪んでしまったのか、覚えてるのはどっちかというとパッとしない変なことばかりだった。Maybe because the shock of the accident sort of warped my memory or whatever in a strange direction. The things I remember of him tend to be kind of bizarre and not straightforward. So here too, it kind of is this almost uncontrollable distortion that you just kind of have to live with and potentially get over, maybe not. Kasahara Mei, I think, has a better time of it than Naoko, but they both end up in similar situations. She ends up going to work at that factory, kind of isolating herself from the rest of the world. And Ibitsu is used to describe the misshapen moon in 1Q84, also used to describe Ushikawa's head. I believe, I can't remember if that's in Wind Up Bird or 1Q84, but this is definitely a word to look out for. I'm sure it's been in other novels as well. It must have been in Hardball Wonderland. I just don't know where. I didn't read that one recently enough to know it offhand, but that is one to keep an eye out for. Now I'm going to get into the predictions I would have made, and I promise that I wrote down most of these actually before the title was announced. I started prep for this podcast in February when the publication of a novel was announced, but then the title was announced in March, and so it kind of threw off these predictions. So my first prediction was, these are predictions / questions that I was kind of asking myself before the novel. Does he rewrite a story? This is a technique that Murakami has used over the years. For Hardball Wonderland, Norwegian Wood, A Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Sputnik Sweetheart are all based on previous works. And we don't know the answer to that yet. I think there's a good chance he does, given the title, but there's also a good chance it's just set in the Hardball Wonderland universe. It's a sequel or related in some kind of way to that previous novella from 1980 or to Hardball Wonderland, and he's just borrowing the title. But I would say I'm pretty happy with that prediction. I think that I've been predicting it for a while, since 1Q84, so since 2009, and I'm finally right. Murakami will go back to the well given the opportunity. My other prediction was the characters will go to a library, and this is also something he's done since early in his fiction. I think kind of indirectly in a Wild Sheep Chase. I don't think they actually go to a library like he does in Dance 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 and 1Q84, where characters go and they spend time like researching. Also in Hardball Wonderland, he does that in both sides of the novel. The Dream Reader is obviously in the library, and then the data agent ends up going to a library to research with the help of the librarian there, and she becomes a character. Um, it's more kind of artfully incorporated into Hardball Wonderland, but there's still these giant kind of research dump sections. Uh, and it'll be interesting to see if he does something similar to that. I think we'll definitely be in a library because the Dream Reader will be going there, but whether he's using it to do a kind of research dump like he has in the past, that I'm not so sure of. I think that Murakami will isolate his characters somehow. That's a tendency he's had from early on in A Wild Sheep Chase. Eventually, the narrator, ends up in a cabin in Hokkaido all on his own, and that is, I think, one of the first times where he really kind of puts the character on his own up there somewhere. In Harbor Wonderland, the narrator kind of is, in these subterranean places. He's isolated in the town, kind of on his own, and then arguably the data agent is isolated within society in Tokyo. But it's not quite the same. In Norwegian Wood, Toru kind of runs off on a trip toward the end of the novel on his own, and is kind of just not paying attention to anyone, living on the beach at times. And so I'd say, yes, that qualifies. In 1Q84, Aomame's all on her own in the room reading Proust. Tazaki Tsukuru is kind of isolated by himself after he gets dumped by his friends. And then in Killing Commendatore, the narrator is an artist who just kind of holds up in this house in Odawara. So I think there's a good chance that this will happen, and it'll be interesting to see how Murakami incorporates it. I was also curious about what role phones will play. This is, a metaphor that Murakami has used for a long time as a kind of method of communication slash mediation, or a mediated method of communication, one that's not purely two characters interacting. They're mediated by this device that is the phone, which I think he uses as a metaphor for humans trying to interact and not fully ever being able to communicate. Wind Up Bird, obviously, it plays a big part. The start of that novel begins with a phone call from an unknown person who's unable to kind of communicate something to Toru. Norwegian Wood and Sputnik Sweetheart both end with phone calls where these characters are kind of like trying to reach out to each other, but maybe unlikely to make a connection. There's ominous phone calls elsewhere in his fiction. Nausea, 1979, is a nice short story. And then 1Q84, there's some kind of, bizarre phone calls that take place. So it will be interesting to see what happens. If it's purely in the end of the world sections, I doubt that there will be any phones. But if the data agent's involved, there very well could be some. It'll also be interesting to see how he's depicting young women in the book. If you missed the last episode of the podcast, I talked about the set of interviews he did with Kawakami Miyako, where he, questions him pretty directly and somewhat intensely about how he's depicting women. And she doesn't mention young women in particular, but she does mention Kasahara Mei as somebody who she relates to more than some other characters. But, he's got a long history. The granddaughter in Harbor Wonderland, Yuki in Dance Dance Dance, who I think is, less sexualized. There's still some gaze there that's maybe uncomfortable at times, but I think more like a kind of for the narrator there is kind of a source of nostalgia as he's going into his late 30s. Murakami probably in his 40s, starting to like look back on youth, and I think she represents that. In Wind Up Bird, we have Kasahara Mei, kind of a troubled, precocious young woman who again has these kind of psychological hangups that she's trying to get over, and there's an interesting relationship there. In 1Q84 and Killing Commendatore, it kind of goes off the rails a little bit more. Fukaeri very much feels like a vehicle of sorts, and Akigawa Marie just feels like an empty character with her obsession over her breasts, and that's the main character that Kawakami Miyako, I think, is kind of questioning. Another kind of question I had is, how is Murakami ending his chapters? I think you can kind of tell whether or not he's under control of the writing if the chapters are or if the chapters are not kind of ending abruptly. If he's overwriting, they'll end abruptly. The halfway point of Dance 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 is, I think, a good example. It's not quite artfully split into 2 volumes. Although, to be honest, Norwegian Wood is split in the middle of the 6th chapter, which is kind of strange. I've never seen that before. And, but yeah, how is he doing that? I think, that was something we saw in the translation of Hardball Wonderland. Those were the places where Birnbaum and Luke were doing a lot of the changes that they were making at ends of chapters and at space breaks to create more dramatic moments than Murakami did in the Japanese. And then, Killing Commendatore ends the first book with a kind of just a quote from another writer, kind of artlessly dropped into the book. So how's he ending chapters? He's not splitting this into 2 volumes. That's one other thing I learned. It's 674 pages. That's now on Amazon. So it'll be 1 volume, 674 pages. So we won't have that kind of split volume, but how is Murakami dividing the novel up, and where are the dramatic moments? Another question I had was, how old are the protagonists? He's had a tendency to write younger protagonists in their 20s and 30s, and he hasn't really deviated much from that. Does he try and write someone older? I guess Minsky is maybe an attempt at that. I don't know, or Nakata and Kafka on the Shore. But is there even an opportunity to do that in the end of the world where characters don't really age, or we don't know if they age? It'll be interesting to see how the ages of his characters are depicted. Another prediction I made that I think was probably more relevant to a different kind of novel was, are his characters telling lies or hesitant to communicate with people? Are there examples of Murakami logic? Often there's this sense with Murakami's characters that there's no way they could contact the authorities. 1Q84 was like this. Aomame had no one she could talk to. It would have been crazy to ask about the kind of alternate universe she had been transported to. Dance 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 also had an egregious version of this, where the narrator's kind of defending this actor friend who doesn't seem like the greatest guy, but he, for whatever reason, he's sticking up for him and not saying anything to the police, and is interrogated by them for hours and hours. And yeah, so I think there's also, I think, in Killing Commendatore, a lot of secrets. I reread my review of that, and I don't remember exactly what was going on, but I, with Minsky and the narrator, there's a lot being withheld from other people in that novel. And I don't know whether the logic makes sense all the time. And then, again, the narrator in Dance Dance Dance, another example, just kind of showing up at the hotel at the end without telling Yumiyoshi anything because he can't communicate over the phone. Maybe kind of artificially build suspense in that novel, although at the same time, maybe that's support for that phone metaphor that I was plugging earlier. So I don't think there'll be quite as much of an opportunity if we're just in the end of the world sections for this to happen, but it's something to keep an eye out for. And then finally, one prediction I made since learning the title of the book, and this is a spoiler-free prediction, is that I bet it has some kind of afterword or forward or something, some kind of note from Murakami himself about the writing and publication of this book, about what he was doing and what he was thinking, why he's making this decision to go back to it. Looking at the history of Murakami and this kind of afterword, forward for his fiction, for his first story collection, Slow Boat to China, he has a very short comment at the beginning that just says kind of where they were published, when they were written, and that it was his first collection. for Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round, a collection from 1985. He has a very long kind of introductory piece of material, but it's part of the conceit of the work, so it is fictionalized itself too. So it's slightly different, but it's new for Murakami. For Norwegian Wood and Dance Dance Dance, he has afterwards. It's a little bit more substantial for Norwegian Wood, but it's still very short compared to Dead Heat. It's doing a little bit more, talking about who it was dedicated to, what he was listening to when he was writing it, and when it was written. Dance 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 really just kind of tells where and when it was written. And then after that, I think the only thing is the long introduction to his short story collection, Men Without Women, describing kind of coming back to the short story form after a long time. And there's nothing else like that, not in the last couple novels. I think given this title and its connection to his past works, I think he'll probably find it difficult to resist taking the opportunity to explain himself a little bit. So I think that will be something to look forward to. I'll be very curious to read that section, to be honest. And if it's an afterword, I might fast forward to it. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe I'll have to wait and see. But I'll be very curious to see what he writes. And so now I'm going to get into the spoiler section. So if you haven't read Hardball Wonderland, now is the time to eject from this podcast. Or if you just don't care, you can stick around. But I would highly recommend going to pick up the translation. I reread the Into the World sections this past week straight through. I had never done that before. It was a really interesting experience. Just reading the even numbered chapters of that book is an incredible experience. It might be the best book Murakami's ever written, to be honest. It's a good bit shorter than the other section. I think I hadn't realized how short it is compared to the other sections of the book, but I think that makes sense. And so I finished rereading that, and I've started rereading the odd number chapters, the Hardball Wonderland sections, because why not? And also I realized a couple things. So now that I've gotten that little tangent out of the way, I'm curious about the woods. Obviously, we don't go to the woods very much. He walks through the woods, kind of mapping out the wall and the town, and then they go back to the power station, which is kind of not too deep in the woods, and so not kind of under that same influence, but there's this kind of sense of being watched, of maybe running into people out there that never really happens. And there's so much talk about the people in the woods that it's a little surprising that we don't ever meet at least someone from the woods in some manner. And maybe Murakami just couldn't pull that off in that draft, either of those drafts, the novella or the novel form. And so I wonder what will happen there. Obviously, the big question is, if it's a sequel, will the narrator help the librarian find her mother? Now that he's recovered some of her mind, she would be kind of eligible to go live in the woods, to be exiled from the town to the woods and live in this location. And I'll be very curious. That's one of the big questions, I think. If the dream reader is able to retain some of his mind, then he wouldn't be able to continue living in the town. We learn that, when the dream reader finally loses the last piece of his mind, he's unable to remain in the town. He's unable to be the dream reader, and so it kind of ends, and he just becomes part of the town. So that's the biggest question. The other question I had after rereading this part of the book is about the librarian's shadow. Well, one thing I had forgotten was that they were separated at age 4. The shadow went to the other world, I think. I don't know if that's exactly how it's worded. I can't remember what it is in Japanese, but leaves the world and then returns at 17 to die in the town. And that's all we hear of that. I'm really curious about that. What that kind of mechanism is, what Murakami's thoughts were on that. Is that something he's going to expand or explore? Do any other members of the town have residual pieces of mind, or is it just the guy over at the power station, the attendant there, and potentially now the librarian, and himself? I guess no one else. Maybe the colonel. I don't know. Not really. I guess I think they make it sound like just because he lost his shadow when he was so much older that he kind of has this residual consciousness of sorts, but it's not quite the same. And then the one other thing that I kind of realized is that in the very last chapter, as the data agent is sitting in his car or listening to, or the data agent, this how it ends is the data agent sitting in his car listening to Bob Dylan, just kind of like thinking about everything he's lost. But before that, he calls his apartment, and the granddaughter is in the apartment. She's kind of gone back to live there, she said. But I forgot that she had promised to freeze him, like kind of cryogenically. So there is a way to bring back that section of the novel somehow. I don't know. Murakami can write his way into it to kind of find a way to bring him back to life. Although, the grandfather the scientist had made it had been pretty pessimistic about whether or not that was actually possible. And the narrator had been pretty resigned to just kind of falling into his internal world. So to kind of go against that again, yeah, I don't know how to feel about that. I feel like what I most want this novel to be is just a continuation of the end of the world sections. I think we obviously lose out something. After I finished reading that half, I was so stunned by how good it was, especially the Birnbaum translation. Obviously they're doing a lot of work there. They're taking a lot of liberties with that translation, but the result is something pretty magical. And so I kind of wanted it to just be an extension of that to a certain extent. But as I started rereading the odd chapters, I realized how much of a contrast those two sections are, how different they are. And the tone they hit is so different. That the odd chapters with this data agent really are like one of the Murakami's greatest versions of his boku narrator, or not in this case it's watashi narrator, but the boku narrator that he wrote for so many of his early works. And I think Birnbaum and Luke do a good job of kind of editing that half of the book. There's some sections that get chopped out, but also it's just really readable and fun. And there's a total attitude there that is so different from the other half of the novel. Plus the immediacy. I had forgotten how powerful that is, and at times can get a little bit boring, I think, but because it's so funny and ironic and self-deprecating, you end up reading through it. Just one section that really struck me that I had kind of flipped through was after they get out of the sewers, the data agent and the granddaughter are trying to talk their way out of the subway in Tokyo, and they get into this circular argument with the gate attendant, and he's like, well, where'd you get on Shibuya? And he's like, well, how do I know that? That seems suspect. Maybe you came from much farther off. And they're like, Shibuya's the end of the line. We can't come from any farther. Well, no, you could have transferred, and you could be coming from Tsudanuma. And he's like, well, I'll pay that. And he's like, well, that's not what I'm saying. You need to pay where you got on. And he's like, well, I'll pay whatever, and then he just kind of slams down 1,000 yen and runs out. But it's the kind of pain in the ass argument that you can imagine actually having in Japan. So things like that, and the immediacy feeling so much slower in time really creates a different effect than the other half of the novel, and is really quite an achievement, I feel like. So while I think I kind of want it to just be the end of the world sections, if he goes for that same idea of balancing the two narratives in terms of immediacy, then I think he would have to write the data agent section of it somehow. Um, so yeah, I can't make a prediction one way or the other, but um, if he does bring back the data agent, I think there's a real question about what does he have him do? Like the only thing really kind of left hanging there are the librarian who he could reconnect with, the granddaughter who I think he kind of promised to sleep with if he made it back alive, and she wouldn't be quite so young then, I guess, maybe, if he's been cryogenically frozen for a long time. It could be an interesting way for Murakami to write about age, now that I think about it, that if this narrator is kind of cryogenically frozen in his permanent adolescency of sorts, then and the rest of the world around him is aged, that could be the perfect metaphor for Murakami and his male narrator. But I don't know if Murakami would write that kind of ironically and satirically anymore. It does feel like he's gone sincere in the last couple of books. It does feel like, I mean, Tazaki Tsukuru, very sincere book, but even the big books are super sincere in their aims, and I think the way it's written, there's not that same sense of humor that really is threaded throughout the data agent half of this book. Obviously, the end of the world section, extremely sincere, intense, kind of like distilled form of Murakami's novel, as I've argued in the past. Distilled yet impressionistic at times. A lone individual who doesn't fit in with a world up against a kind of violent system that encloses people and keeps them somewhat mindless and locked into the system. Not an inappropriate metaphor for modern society to a certain extent. So that's another thing to look out for, is where's the tone? Is it sincere? Is there any humor at all? If it's in the end of the world, I think it's mostly sincere. If there's the data agent, you have the opportunity for more humor, but the novella was extremely sincere. There was none of the data agent section, obviously, so it's maybe even more intense than the end of the world sections in the novel version, because in the novella, the narrator does escape from the town and regrets it, and is kind of mourning that loss of never being able to reconnect with the narrator, or of the librarian Anata, in the novella, addressed directly like that. And I think that might be it. I don't know. I've run out of my notes. A lot of that was unprompted, to be honest. And I feel like my strength as a podcaster is mostly when I've taken notes, but some of this, I guess I've just been thinking about so much over the past several months and longer than that, several years, decades. So it wasn't that difficult, but we'll see what happens in not too long from now. In actually, let's see, 26 hours, it will be midnight in Tokyo. And I should have a Kindle version of it. I made a round of a couple bookstores yesterday and didn't see it on the shelf. In 2009, when 1Q84 was coming out, I was working in Shimbashi, Tokyo, and I was taking the day off. It was a Friday when it was coming out, and I was going to take the day off to read the novel. And I think like on Wednesday, I just walked by a random tiny little bookstore in Shimbashi, as you see, not like a Kinokuni or anything, just a little, shoten, where they've got lots of mostly magazines, but also some, new books and stuff like that. And there it was, like 2 days early, just sitting on the shelf, and I bought it, no problem at all. But I waited to read it until Friday. And so I was wondering, oh, maybe that would happen here. But no, obviously, I think it's a little bit more locked down these days. And I even went to the bookstore at the grocery store that's right across from my apartment. I thought, well, maybe they would just kind of put it out, but nothing yet. So I think I'll probably have a digital version right at midnight. And then I've got an Amazon delivery coming the next day that should deliver it right as on the day it's released. And so we'll know then. We'll know in 26 hours what's going on with this book. My plan for the rest of this podcast season is to do a quick reaction. I'll probably try and read the first chapter immediately at midnight and record some initial thoughts split into both non-spoiler and spoiler versions so that people can kind of jump out in the middle and then or stick around if they want to know more. But if you don't want to know anything at all, I would say just avoid the next episode completely. And then we'll see after that. I'll probably take a little bit of a break from podcasting until I get through the novel. Maybe I'll do a halfway point. But yeah, the last couple of weeks have been a bit exhausting with the bibliography episodes. I hope you do listen to those at some point, because I think it's an interesting look at exactly how productive Murakami's has been and gives us a lot of context for where he is in his career. So yeah, look forward to that and check in with the podcast tomorrow night if in Japan time, and I guess that'll be probably Wednesday morning US time if you want to know more about the city and its uncertain walls, as Murakami is putting it on in English on the subtitle of his book. I am very curious to see where we go now. 38 years after writing Horrible Wonderland and 43 years after writing a novella with this original title.